Hello everyone and welcome back in. Well, here we are, episode number 4 of our Unimog special set in the Bush Wars in Rhodesia, circa 1965 to 1979-1980. Of course, in the previous episodes 1 through 3, we worked on building the Unimog itself. We did an episode on painting the Unimog, the camouflage finish, and weathering. Spent an entire episode creating the figures, painting those out. And we just got a taste of start at working on the base. Well, guess what we're doing on this episode? This is all about the base, setting the scene for our Unimog. Once again, we have a ton of work to do, so let's get started. Well, just to set the scene slightly here, we'll take a trip backwards to episode 3. Again, episode 3 was mostly about painting the figures, but I did have a little interlude, a little diversion where we started working on the base. Most specifically, we started to create a tree based on some reference materials, some reference images that I found from Mr. Google. If you missed any of that, please just go back and look at episode 3. You can catch right back up and join us here where we are right now. But the important part is that we have a tree, and then we started to sort of lay out what might be the scene for this presentation of our Unimog. And yes, look at this. I actually have paper and pen. I'm actually kind of sketching things out here for a change, trying to set the scene, trying to get an idea of where it is and what I want to do. And now we have cut out some foam here. It's not quite to size yet, but we have some basic layouts here. Again, sort of following my basic idea here, sketched out on the piece of paper. You can see a little raised area in the back. We're going to put the tree in there. We're going to plant our tree, of course. And if you recall from episode 3, I talked about perhaps we'll be adding a water feature. I'm going to decide to do that, so we'll be adding water into this episode as well, pouring some resin. And while this is not the final composition of the scene, you'll see that will change over time. What I am trying to work on right now is basically the size of the base itself. I try to, as best I can, to make the base as compact or as small as possible. That way the focus is really on the model itself, and in this case, the couple of figures that go along with it. Of course, we'll landscape around that. You can see in the front corner, I've added a bit of a divot there. That's where the water feature is going to be. Of course, we have a little raised area in the back, adding a little interest to the scene as well. That's where the tree is. And now we have our figures, just pop those in there, kind of get a layout of the landscape here, how much space things are going to be taking up. I work very much kind of by look and feel here. So as much as I might sketch something out or even sketch on the foam here, a lot of this is going to come down to making some cuts, putting some constraints in there, say by size because I've made the cuts, and then making do with what I have. In the end, I have something that looks basically like this, and as you can tell, I obviously followed my pattern just to the T. And so now let's get serious about this base work. Well, looking through those images, the reference images of this part of the world, this part of Africa, I noticed that it's bush country. It can be arid and dry, but there's also quite a few rivers and streams and watering holes and ponds and things like that are running through the landscape. And I thought, you know what, that would add just a nice bit of visual interest, something a little eye-catching here on the side of the scene. So we're going to spend some time here getting ready to pour some resin to make some water features here. First thing I did, of course, we cut out a bit of that divot there in the corner just to lower the landscape a bit. And now I'm just cutting back a bit on the shoreline using the X-Acto knife. Okay, now here we go with we're going to start off here with the resin. So first things first, I added a little bit of height to the base, just another layer of foam underneath. I think it's going to look a little bit better, and it gives me a little more working room here, so that's great. Second thing we really need to address, and this would be the case no matter what type of resin you're pouring, is that we need to make a barrier so everything just doesn't flow out off the edge of the base and all over your workspace. I'm using balsa wood here. This will be the edge of the base as a whole. Got those in place, got the pieces in place here, and now I'm just using Mod Podge and liberally just pouring it into these edges here just to kind of help make kind of a seal up the barrier there. We're going to come back in just a minute and really put a seal on this, but this is first level of sealing things up. I'm also applying the Mod Podge to the balsa wood itself in order to kind of seal up the surfaces on that as well, just to kind of make sure everything doesn't seep into the wood. And now for this little area where we're going to pour the resin. I'm going to use Magic Sculpt here, and the reason I'm doing that, say, as opposed to the Sculpey that I've been using on a lot of other bases, is that I know that the Magic Sculpt is going to dry rock hard and is very impervious to resins and things like that. So I'm basically making a bathtub, if you will, here using the Magic Sculpt. Just kind of pressing that into place, making sure that all the little cracks, all the little crevices are all filled up, all around the edges, anything like that. And that's so important for two different reasons. One, we don't want the resin to leak out. But secondly, if the resin comes in contact with the foam, it's just going to eat the foam away and dissolve it into some sort of a icky, gooey mess that you really just cannot recover from. So this needs to be impervious. This area needs to be impervious to the resin, first touching the foam and secondly, leaking out from the sides. Well, I'm going to give the Magic Sculpt some time to cure there, so in the meantime, I'm going to use the Sculpey. Now, I can use this on the remainder of the base. It's much easier to work with, just to give myself some surface texture here. The basic premise is that there's going to be a road kind of going by the side of the water here, the tree on the background, so just kind of making some road ruts and such in here, but also at the same time, of course, you want to drop your model onto the base, make sure everything touches on all the contact points. After a few, a couple hours of drying time here, went ahead and painted everything out black just to make sure everything's colored and covered and unified there in terms of a base color. At this stage, the base already has quite a bit of texture through some sand, some little pebbles and rocks that I've added, and the Sculpey itself, but it's going to add one more layer of texture here and some color by adding some AK terrains. This happens to be desert sand, nice medium to fine grit texture, just applied overall, thinned out with some water. This is that special time when I get to say thank you to my Patreon. It's these people that you see scrolling across your screen that make this channel possible. If you enjoy this channel and would like to support it, I do encourage you to please come visit us over on Patreon. In return for your support, special Patreon videos, photos of work in progress, a Discord server where we can show off our projects. I do hope that you consider supporting the channel. Thank you so very much. Well, as you might imagine, that after adding the Magic Sculpt and the Sculpey and a layer of paint and a layer of terrains texture, that I need to let that set aside for a little while and really cure up and dry before I start playing with the resin. So, in the meantime, quite a few comments after episode number 2 about which we painted some of the stowage in the back of the Unimog saying, hey, you know what, it's a good start, but it would look even better if you really filled up the back end there with some equipment and made it a little bit more lived in. And I thought, you know what, you're right. So while everything takes some time and cure here, let's spend the afternoon, well, at least I spent the afternoon, making some tarps and painting up a few more resin pieces from Value Gear. Now, the tarps themselves, once again, this is Milliput, just rolled out very, very thin using baby powder so it doesn't stick, and just putting those in place. We'll start adding more and more elements to the back of the Unimog here over this afternoon, and just getting everything set into place. Again, a little bit more lived-in feel here. I think that's looking great. Thank you guys for your suggestions. It always helps, keeps me moving forward, and I do appreciate them. And then finally, one little trick here. So I drink tea most every morning, and the little strings on the tea bags, well, if you ever looked at those are perfect 1/35 scale ropes. No fuzz on them. Just pull them off. You can color them if you need to. A little bit of white glue and water to set it into place. Done. Okay, let's return back to our base here. So now let's just add some color here, make sure everything's starting to get unified before we start pouring our resin here. Acrylic colors literally just washes over the top. No airbrush, no oil paints this time, at least not yet anyway. Just such a quick process, just adding the paints directly onto the surface, using some water, spreading it around. And now we have those broad brush strokes of color here. Now I want to pick out some of these colors, and especially important here, this corner is where we're going to be pouring our resin, our water feature. So I want to get those elements in place right now, getting those little details set up. We're going to add some color to some of those rocks, make them kind of sparkle and shine. Add some textures here right towards the end at the shoreline. Just little bits of rock and stones and things from my blue bowl of good stuff, some little sticks and twigs, starting adding to those features before I start pouring the resin. And as long as I'm at it, let's go ahead and kind of decorate some of the rest of the scene as well. So overall, this is really starting to take shape now. We have a very nice groundscape, I think. It's really starting to come together. We've got some nice details here. Those rocks, painting out those rocks really adds some nice, little pops of color and visual interest here. We've got our ground textures in place. We're starting to pick out some of these different branches and things like that with our acrylic colors. We're getting to that point now. I think it's about time to go ahead and start to pour our resin water feature in place. The resin that I'll be using is from AK, and it is a clear resin. And it is also a two-part resin, meaning that you have a hardener and you have your resin. In this case, it's 2 parts resin to 1 part hardener. I know that sometimes if you think about working with resin, it might seem very challenging or even scary, but it's really a very simple process. Just keep a few things in mind. We've already done a couple of things. We've made an area where the resin is going to go into. We've got a barrier around the outside with our balsa wood. We've made a basin for the resin to go into where it will not touch the foam through the magic sculpt. And so now it's time to mix the resin. And in this case, I have 8 mils of resin, so that's the 2-part, and into a disposable cup. That makes it easy to clean up. I'm going to add half of that, or 4 mils of the catalyst. And the syringes, make sure you use different syringes for each part of this, otherwise you'll just get them to catalyze within your syringe. Now we stir it together, and this is an important part here, especially working with clears. We do not want to incorporate air into the mix. So stir slowly, just trying to mix it together. And one of the things you'll notice with clear resins, you'll know when it's mixed, it starts out kind of cloudy. It goes cloudy as you start to mix it together. Again, we're mixing slowly here. And then at some point, it turns back into a clear. That's when you know your A and your B are totally incorporated and you're ready to pour. Now in this case, I don't want necessarily a totally clear resin here. I don't want to see exactly to the bottom. I want a little bit of a cloudiness. So I'm adding just a couple, or actually basically 1 drop at the end of a toothpick of just an off-white green color, just to cloud up the mix a little bit. This is the point where you can make it a green, a blue, deep sea blue, something like that, if you really wanted to change the color of your resin. Once that's incorporated, then it's just a matter of pouring it into your area. Notice that I'm using the little stick. The idea here is, once again, we want to collapse the bubbles or any air that's in the resin drizzle as it drizzles down, and the stick will help do that. We want just kind of a fine little drizzle coming down in there, and we're just going to let that flow. Everything just kind of flows around easily into all the little spaces. Now this little area, this corner here, using the resin, this is a very relatively small area, so I can do this all in 1 pour. I don't need to pour layer upon layer. But if this was a bigger body of water, say it was deeper, something like that, then I would want to do that in multiple layers. So I would add, say, I don't know, less than 1 inch, 3/4 of an inch of resin. What would that be in centimeters? Someone help me out there. Let that cure, and then add another layer, and then another layer. And the reason for that is because resin, as it cures, it gets very, very hot, and we want each layer to be able to cure, and then we'll keep adding layers over the top of it. Did this at the end of the evening, covered up with some plastic so nothing would fall into it, dust and things like that. Next morning, give it a light touch. Yep. Oh, it's hard. Well done, Rick. It worked. It's always one of those moments where you go like, okay, did it work? Is it going to work? But you never know until you actually, the time goes by, in this case, overnight. At this point, we could leave the resin alone as is, just move on with our project and continue working. However, if you notice, especially around the shoreline there, you see that little bright sparkle. Well, that's where the resin has soaked into some of the groundwork, or cupped up into it, or wicked up into those surface features. And it's kind of an unnatural look, an unnatural appearance here. So we're going to take care of that. So the first thing I'm going to do here is just kind of extend the shoreline a bit by just painting some acrylic color, the same sand color, just over the top of the resin, basically to extend the shoreline a bit. And then the second detail that I really need to take care of here, and this is going to take a little bit of time, is I want to make sure that the edges of the base here are all nice and smooth, and that includes the resin itself, or the water feature. Once again, because we have that balsa wood or the edging there, the resin has made a kind of a cup, so there's a little bit of an edge there. So first cutting back the balsa wood so it's even with the base level of, or the surface layer of the resin, and then I'm cutting back the resin itself, making sure everything's nice and flat and smooth right there. I'm not a fan of looking to the side of resin, so my point is, if we look into the side of resin or water features, why don't we look into the side of, say, the earth? But that's just me. But once I have everything cut back, then it's just a matter of polishing the resin back. Start out with a 220 grit sandpaper, just easily polishing that back. Subsequent layers of more fine sandpaper as I continue to polish this back, finishing up with a 2000 grit. And that just returns the luster and the shine where we've cut back on that resin. And now I can go ahead and finish up this area. So we're once again working on the shoreline here. And again, it's a matter of just taking out wherever you see the shine here. And it's really just a camouflage sort of thing. So we've already added a bit of that acrylic underneath there, just kind of painted that on here. I'm using the AK terrains here just to give it some more, well, texture itself and just kind of extending that shoreline a bit. And then once everything starts coming together, now I can start adding the final touches to the scene, adding some very fine grasses, some weeds, some things from the blue bowl of good stuff. And yep, here we go. We've got our tree. We're ready to plant our tree. Finally, just kind of stick that in place there. And with that, yep, we have made a Rhodesian base here. Now we just need to put everything together. And here are our final photographs of the scene and how it turned out. And that's going to bring us to the end of this series. We've got 4 episodes in on the Unimog and the Rhodesian theme. And quite honestly, this was a theme, the Rhodesia Bush Wars, that I had very, very limited knowledge on. But I'm really glad that we went down this road, and I've really enjoyed researching this and bringing this to life. It's always interesting how these projects kind of develop over time, and keep in mind that we started out just with the Unimog. That was this build here. This is what the project was, trying to figure out a theme that led us to Rhodesia, researching the camouflage. Then we got into the figures, and yes, I understand that the figures are not exactly accurate, but trying to find accurate figures on the market, well, that's a challenge. However, I did have a fantastic time researching the camouflage and even painting the camouflage, so that was a lot of fun. I hope you enjoyed it as well. If you enjoy this channel, please hit that like and subscribe. It is so very important. If you'd like to support this channel even further, please, I do have a Patreon page. I'd love to see you over there and have your support. In the meantime, I think that's going to do it for us. Till the next time, take care everybody, and happy modeling.